is Sharon Wilder. I'm the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at Montgomery College. I just want to welcome you all to this program today. I am so excited to have this amazing panel of professionals with us this evening, some from Montgomery College and also from UMBC. After acknowledgements and community agreements, we'll be welcomed by Dr. KATYA SALMI, who is a sociology assistant professor at Montgomery College, to talk really about what lay the foundation for critical race theory and what it actually does mean. Next, we'll be hearing from Mr. Eric Ford and Dr. Kelly Quinn from UMBC, talking about applied racial equity in the choice program at UMBC. And then we'll be moving on to Dr. Emerald Jones, who's a sociology professor at Montgomery College, talking about race, gender, ethnic disparity, and differences in policing practices. From there, she will be followed by Sonia Pruitt, who is a criminal justice professor at Montgomery College, who will be addressing systemic racism, accountability, policy, and legislation. Ms. Pruitt, by the way, I may have to add that she is also a retired captain from Montgomery County Police Department. And following Ms. Pruitt will be Ms. Ginger Robinson, who is a criminal justice professor at Montgomery College. And from many things I have heard in the community, she has just been making her own mark on all things legislative and with counsel. So she's going to be talking to us about intervention and legislative change from a criminal justice to criminal legal, and I'll let her tell you all about that.
I am providing an overview of critical race theory to set the scene for my esteemed colleagues who are going to talk to have a more focused conversation around the criminal legal system. And what I wanted to do tonight is to first look at the context for why we are discussing this topic of critical race theory. I will provide an overview of critical race theory. What is it actually? It's not quite what we're hearing in the media. And then I'm gonna give some examples from Montgomery County to display the local relevance of this topic and how we can view current issues from the lens of critical race theory. So let's begin with the backlash in legislation. What's the deal with critical race theory? A lot of the discussions around critical race theory emerged at a really critical time that we were experiencing in the last 2 years. We saw the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in 2020. Of course, 2020 was also when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we were witness to all of the inequities that not only did the pandemic highlight, but also that it magnified and worsened. The murders of Black people at the hands of police sparked a lot of social unrest and protests for Black lives and for broader social justice matters. And this resulted in an increased interest across the country and across the world in dealing with racial equity and anti-racism. We saw a boom in the workshops and trainings around racial sensitivity, white privilege, and the like, discussions around white privilege. But that was also met with a backlash. In September 2020, former President Trump issued an executive ban that resulted in a whole onslaught of other bans initiated by states. A little bit more to that context, or an example, is the 1619 Project. This project was done in collaboration with New York Times Magazine, but it was led by Nicole Hannah Jones, as well as other historians and journalists. And what this project sought to do was to reflect on the American history of slavery and its legacies. The legacies that I'm talking about is how contemporary forms of racism and discriminations are intimately and directly linked to the past of this country, especially the slavery the segregation that ensued after the end of slavery, and then the resulting inequities that remain to this day. This historical perspective, though, it was in the first place, it was trying to counter the minimum and limited education that many folks have around slavery and its legacies. People in schools, children in schools aren't necessarily taught about this past, which is a really important past to consider when learning about this country's history. But this was met with a lot of pushback. Trump created the 1776 Commission, which was established to counter the narrative of this 1619 project. And it resulted in a whitewashed history that ignores the role of race and racism and how they played in the history. In his final few months in office, he stated that he would ban the teaching of the project and accused history educators of teaching children to hate their own country. And so this commission was set to promote patriotic education. And so even though this project wasn't necessarily about critical race theory, it was treated as emblematic of critical race theory and even cited in legislation that proposed bans and seen as racially divisive and a revisionist account of history. So in September 2020, President Trump issued an executive order that banned federally funded racial sensitivity trainings that discuss topics that include white privilege, critical race theory, all of which he perceived as divisive anti-American propaganda. Now, despite incoming President Biden rescinding this action after he took office, and he even required more federal agencies to advance equity for historically underserved communities, there was still this conservative backlash against critical race theory, and it continued to gain momentum even after Trump left office. So this map that you see here shows the most recent, actually not quite the most recent because Maryland is now on there, I think, but one of the most recent iterations of where there have been bans or bills proposed. So you see here in blue, it's where bills were signed and it was approved. Yellow is where it was proposed and moving through. Red is where states that have vetoed or overturned such bills. And then the grays are where there have been no actions. So you can see that this is going all over the place. This is happening all over the country. And thank you to Professor Robinson, who alerted us to this earlier today, so I was able to add it to my presentation. There is a House bill in the Maryland State Legislature that proposes to prohibit teaching that is related to critical race theory, and you can check out the wording of this link below. I'll try to type it in the chat afterwards. But what this bill does is that they are going to consider banning talking about certain things in classrooms. So we'll have to keep an eye out on these developments. Why the backlash, though? You know, why has there been this reaction to discussing racism and anti-racism? So there are several main arguments against critical race theory that are raised by different folks. As we saw in one of my previous slides, it's considered to be un-American. It's seen as threatening to a tradition that values, the Constitution and liberty and freedoms, and criticisms of founding fathers and the systems that they established are perceived as un-American. Some have characterized critical race theory as a Marxist coup. Why? This is a very tangential link that is made where because critical theory has foundations in a particular theoretical field, it's deemed too leftist and therefore Marxist. Some have characterized it as a government-led conspiracy that is coming from top down to impose a way of thinking to our children. Others argue that critical race theory and related education sets differences in stone. By this, I mean that, if you tell kids that there are some macro level issues that may impact their life, that because of the color of their skin, i.e., for example, we know that job candidates can face discrimination based on the color of their skin. So this argument is saying that you're telling minoritized folks that they can't amount to anything if you're using critical race theory. Others perceive it also as an assault on freedom of speech, that by trying to teach about race and racism and all the things that critical race theory allows us to do, we're limiting others' freedom of speech to say what they want, even if it's racist. Ironically, what these bans are doing could also be considered an assault on freedom of speech. Others kind of are spewing the same spiel that we've been hearing for decades, that political correctness has gone mad, right? We've been hearing this since like the 80s and 90s, but some folks consider that there's too much political correctness nowadays. Others feel that it's divisive, that we're making kids feel bad by teaching them about the legacy of white supremacy and its impact on our communities and our society. And others just plain call it racist, that to talk about race in itself, to talk about racism is in and of itself a racist approach, because you're perpetuating those differences. Now, kind of thinking a little bit more deeply though about the backlash against critical race theory, we can see though that it is reactionary, and some even consider it a diversion. It's creating punitive and legislative responses that prevent further investigation and discussion of race-related issues. Now those who are working in these fields are increasingly worried about their ability to talk about racism and to fight those very injustices that we need to fight against. Others see it as a diversion, that this increasing denials of institutional and systemic racism and discrimination is part of this backlash, right? Kind of like we focus on creating this big bad monster of critical race theory, and that creates a diversion away from dealing with and addressing the actual issues at hand. As Ibram X. Kendi said, there's a concerted backlash from people who recognize that this time last year, a growing number of Americans were either speaking out against racism or growing an awareness of the problem of racism. That growing awareness has put a spotlight on certain policies and certain ideas, and even certain people who have been facilitating systemic racism. But then what is critical race theory actually? I think when we've been hearing about critical race theory in the media, often there's a very big misunderstanding about what it entails. People mention it, but without having actually engaged with the materials, the source materials that have been, a part of the legal tradition for several decades. But to summarize, it's a theoretical framework for understanding inequalities and racism. It emerged from critical legal scholarship in the 70s and 80s. Some notable foundational figures are Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris, just to name a few. But the main question that critical race theory seeks to answer is why and how racial disparities continue to exist in our society and social institutions, even though segregation ended and discrimination has been banned from a legal standpoint. One big question that it asks is, to what extent are colorblindness and an idea of meritocracy misleading? The idea that of the American dream, that anyone can make it, does it mislead us in thinking that there is equality for all in practice? The main tenets of critical race theory are are pretty clear, actually. First of all, it posits that race is socially constructed. It's not a biological reality. It looks at racism as embedded in the fabric of our society and our social institutions, rather than an aberration. Racism is not a one-off. It's not down to an individual who has a racist thought about their neighbor down the road. It's part of the system, according to critical race theory. One of the tenets of critical race theory also looks at the issue of interest convergence, how a lot of the advances that were made in terms of civil rights and ending segregation were actually coming at a point where it benefited everyone to make those changes, not necessarily because the people that pushed for legislative changes were particularly interested in the social justice aspect. Critical race theory also examines negative stereotypes and the way that they shape perceptions of race across society. It uses intersectionality to bring in different experiences to understand how other factors like gender, class, and so on impact people's race situation. And one of the key elements is also lived experiences and storytelling, and how those stories are very crucial to understand the current situation of racial inequities in our society. The benefit of critical race theory is that it's actually very relevant for understanding other forms of oppressions. A lot of different theoretical perspectives have been developed to building on the tradition of critical race theory, such as Latinx critical race theory, critical philosophy of race, disability critical race theory studies. It's also useful in understanding international context. I personally have used critical race theory to understand and analyze the French approach to race that says there are no races in France, and how that approach inhibits an adequate discussion of racial inequalities in France. And just one example here of how it can be applied is you can use critical race theory as this article does to understand how some are excluded, how undocumented US workers are excluded in economic relief policies. But there are a number of ways that critical race theory has been used to enhance our understanding. There's a domino effect as well. And I think that these bans have also empowered folks to limit, what is perceived as woke in our society. They're banning books such as the graphic novel Mouse. They're banning discussions around gender and sexuality, dismissing and hindering anti-racist efforts. And, very worryingly, they're increasing harm towards groups that are already experiencing marginalization. Just last week, or 2 days ago, I think, Texas Governor Greg Abbott directed agencies to investigate parents of children who identify as transgender as potential abusers. And I think this is part and parcel of the same issue that is where conservatives are trying to limit kind of this perceived wokeness. Finally, I wanted to discuss the relevance of critical race theory for our local context. Just kind of a small example to show why it might matter to us here, for those of us who live in Montgomery County or in the area. So I serve on the President's Advisory Committee for Equity and Inclusion, and I work with Subcommittee 1, working on the first goal of the Equity Roadmap, which is to improve the persistence, retention, and completion graduation transfer for all students, particularly African male and Latinx students. So throughout my time working on this committee, we've been focusing a lot on what's happening, what can we do at Montgomery College to address the inequitable success rates of certain students. But then I was thinking, as I was preparing this presentation, what do I know about what's happening in Montgomery County? And it really kind of thinking about it through this lens of critical race theory, it got me to think about what is the situation here. There's actually quite a lot of racial inequities in Montgomery County. For example, in June 2020, the county council approved a resolution that was put forward by council member Jawando that declared racism a public health crisis because data has shown that Black and Latinx residents are facing more harmful, they're experiencing death and negative health outcomes at a greater rate than other populations, not just in Montgomery County, but in Maryland and in the whole country. But also digging a little bit deeper, I found that there are actually quite a few indicators where Black and Latino residents have worse outcomes than white residents. So for example, I'm going to show you the next slide because it shows it graphically, but you can, on a graph, I mean. So we see that there are different outcomes in terms of how much people are paying for rent, levels of unemployment, and numbers of arrests, in not having access to a vehicle, access to healthcare, how many children live in poverty, and also the suspension rates. And I got this data from the Office of Legislative Oversight. And then digging a little bit deeper, there are disparate educational outcomes in Montgomery County. So despite initiatives from the 80s, since the 80s to address the achievement gap, there's still a lot of segregation, like de facto segregation, unequal funding, and unequal results between white students and non-white students. For example, Black and Latinx students were only up to half as likely as Asian white students to demonstrate math or English language arts proficiency or college readiness based on their SAT or AP IB performance. Recently, there were efforts to evaluate and change existing boundaries to desegregate schools that have been met with resistance by parents. So this is an ongoing issue. And the reason I discuss it is because I also just learned that Montgomery College itself was segregated, and so it was segregated until about, I think, 1960. And prior to that, Black students were attending the George Washington Carver Junior College, which I didn't know is right across the street from our main campus. And this just got me thinking about how we can use critical race theory to establish these connections. What we're doing at Montgomery College in my subcommittee that I work with on success rates at MC, they're linked to these inequitable racial outcomes across the county. And tools like critical race theory are important because they allow us to make those connections. And I really like this quote by sociologist Ali Maggi from the UK, who really describes this. This is why CRT is important, because it shows that all individuals, groups, institutions, and social structures are part of the racialized social system, and consequently that any anti-racist movement has to not just tackle micro phenomena or the role of organizations or the macro structure, but the totality of these relations. And hopefully in our discussion tonight, my colleagues are going to discuss the kind of critical race theory and its relevance in the criminal legal system in order to kind of look at how we can do that in practice. Thank you very much.
At UMBC and at the Choice Program, we have a tradition where we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And we acknowledge today humbly that we are working. I am seated what was the original ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. Perhaps you are seated in the lands of the Susquehannock people. And why I think it's especially important to call the names of those first people in these lands is that in fact we know our nation was founded on some of the first acts were settler colonialism, and our first political acts were the taking of lands of Native people. So we invoke their names, and as we, Eric and I, and as the Choice Program and as colleagues in community tonight, we want to think about how we are ethical stewards of this legacy. And so we want to pay homage to those. We also want to think about the young people that we at the Choice Program have been serving for the past 35 years. And we are a youth-centered organization, and we use applied critical race theory. And tonight, we're here to talk to you about how we've been on a journey really embodied in Eric Ford's work and leadership at the organization to listen to young people. And this image on our screen is from an action that we ran in 2016, where young people talked about what they want in their communities. And we can see in the graffiti here that what they're calling for are institutions that will serve them well. They're calling for more rec centers, more schools, more safety. They want more sport, places to ride dirt bikes. That is a very Baltimore City thing, friends in Montgomery County. They want better police. They want more jobs, and they want help when they age out of foster care. In short, they're demanding better systems, ones that are trauma responsive, that are youth-centered, and that are culturally appropriate. When we listen to them, what we know is that they themselves do not see them as being defined by policy. Even though we carry the weight of centuries of white supremacy culture, they don't want to be defined by that policy. They insist we're not, quote unquote, juvenile delinquents. They reject that phrase. They don't want to be seen as school dropouts. They don't want to be seen as at-risk youth. And they certainly don't see themselves as super predators. Our organization was founded when we had the myth of the predator. And Eric is now going to reflect on that because he was in many ways present at the creation. So he'll talk to us about how our model and our theoretical framework has changed since the 1980s through this very afternoon.
Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Eric Ford, Director for the Choice Program at UMBC. As Dr. Kelly Quinn mentioned, we provide mentoring and advocacy for young people throughout Central Maryland, some of whom are involved with the Department of Juvenile Services. So this graphic here kind of explains just the transition and evolution of some key phrases and terms that I'm going to touch on in just a second, but also the evolution of our program. So DMC, it stands for Disproportionate Minority Contact. And as I became director of Choice and I was afforded the opportunity to sit on the Open Society's Leadership Council and Maryland's Juvenile Justice Reform Council, it was explained that the schools and communities of youth of color were over-policed, and that youth of color were not using drugs or committing crimes at a higher rate, but the excessive police presence in neighborhoods led to more arrests. It struck me that our model that relied heavily on monitoring and surveillance was complicit in this effort and acting as an arm of the state, and this had to change. It was at this moment that I fully understand critical race theory, or fully understood critical race theory. Not only was racism embedded in the youth legal system, it permeated the very program that I was leading. And I served as a mentor in the Choice program in 1993 and came back to Choice in 2011 and ascended to director in 2018. So the next concept is what we use today, race and ethnic disparities. And as advocates pushed harder for systems change, DMC no longer was adequate in describing disparate outcomes in the youth legal system. Race and ethnic disparities was the new flavor of the month. And as we evolved as a program, we embraced critical race theory. It became clear to my leadership team that critical race theory became a tool that anchored our work and in becoming an anti-racist organization. And we needed to acknowledge the past and present harm of the youth legal system, a system that begins with under-resourced schools, moves to over-policed communities, and ends with the disproportionate charging of youth as adults. So we had to change the narrative about who youth are and what they can become. Our work as we seek to disentangle Black and Latinx youth from the oppressive state and economic systems is rooted in applied critical race theory. What's interesting about these terms is periodically someone will come up with a new term to describe the root causes and conditions of people of color, but there's an intentional avoidance of the use of using what is truly the prevalence of white supremacy. And then this takes us to Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, TRHT. What makes our systems change work difficult is that our program is operating within the institution of higher ed, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. But the American Association of Colleges and Universities introduced us to the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework. UMBC, Shriver Center, and now Montgomery College, who I'm serving as a mentor as they embark on their journey through TRHT, are campus centers. And we seek to reframe the stories of the oppressive youth legal systems with new stories, amplifying the voices of young people's lived experiences. And we hold the truth that the healing aspects of TRHT, and we also have taken on a very intentional journey in trying to impact policy change. When I was a mentor in the early 1990s, the column on the left was the model that we used to serve young people. It was based on the super predator myth and supported and funded by the Biden crime bill. This was the model through 2018, and we were faced with ongoing police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. As a program that amplifies the youth of voice and families in Maryland, we responded to the demands of the protesters across the country, the uprising in Baltimore, and the movement for Black lives. Through a period of self-examination, we questioned our services and moved from monitoring to mentoring. On the right, you will see some of the hallmarks of that. Through this change, we have maintained our value of high expectations, but what we realize is that you don't need to see youth every day, sometimes multiple times a day, in order to help them, support them in reaching their goals. So we strive to not be an apparatus of the state, and we were complicit and changed our model. And this is a call to action for people to really look at your practices and try to change your model and your systems of delivery, whether it be education, advocates, mentors, but just look through a critical lens. When we meet young people where they are, we are applying critical race theory in our work, and we recognize the importance of lived experiences. We recognize that one of the first acts of the state was settler colonialism and genocide of indigenous people. And the next act was the creation of the fallacy of the hierarchy of human value based on race. And we're committed to its elimination. So I want to share a brief video that we did in partnership with young people from an organization, a youth media company in Baltimore called Wide Angle Youth Media, where we action people to help us change the narrative and how people view it. So I'll share it just briefly.
If you're talking, writing, or making media about youth, there are a few things you need to know.
Our past does not define us. Where we've been and our mistakes are just one part of our story.
Listen to how we define ourselves and know the history of how we've been defined by policies.
We are not juvenile delinquents, school dropouts, at-risk youth, or super predators.
Be creative with how you choose to talk about us. Not everything is about our past trauma.
Pause and check in with our parent, guardian, or mentors to make sure that we are comfortable sharing our stories.
Be present when you are with us.
Let us know your questions beforehand.
Be patient. Make sure to allow extra time when working with us.
Give us a chance to review and give feedback before you share the final product.
Before you work with us, we want you to remember that we're just kids. And while we're still learning and finding our place, we don't want to be misrepresented. Thank you for listening.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for that. What is it? A picture is worth 1,000 words. That video was just absolutely well done. And I'm hoping, Brandon Wallace, I saw you on here, that you got some tips for what we can show at MC. Is that right? Let me see where, I think I saw you on here somewhere. Brandon Wallace is, we were together this morning at lunchtime, actually. And he was the host and moderator of another activity where some of the men that are actually on this Zoom tonight participated in about the Presidential Scholars Program. It would be great if you could drop that link in the chat, Brandon or Dr. Benjamin, when you get an opportunity. And so now we're going to move on then to race, gender, ethnic disparity, and differences in policing practices. Get into some stuff here with Dr. Emerald Jones. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. It's so good to be here. First and foremost, I want to say I'm just grateful and honored to be able to be on a panel with these amazing individuals. That's one. And two, shout out to my students for actually taking the time to join and registering and attending. This is very important, and you get to see me in a different light. So I am very appreciative. I did not create a PowerPoint, but I just want to have a conversation, and I really want to talk to you about some things. So when we're going to get into race, gender, ethnic disparities, and policing practices, first, I have three major components that I want to touch on. We're going to start about a historical overview. I'm going to give you some examples that really shaped why this is so important. Then we're going to move to theoretical approaches. I'm going to give you two important theories that I want to touch on that helps explain, and it goes back on what my colleagues discussed prior to, and then methodological approaches. I recently conducted a study and found some major disparities within the data set that I use that I want to talk about. So first and foremost, 1992, Rodney King was a monumental, it was huge due to the fact of police officers being caught on camera. That's one. But at the same time, 5 years later, you had Sandra Antar. She was brutally beaten by police officers in South Carolina on Interstate I-95. And that media coverage was very limited. Second, we have Eric Garner, who sustained injuries and it was caught on camera. You also had Roseanne Miller, was placed in a chokehold and was 7 months pregnant. You have Freddie Gray. He sustained injuries while being in police custody. You had Alicia Thomas, was beaten by Los Angeles in 2012 in the back of a cruiser. So what you're seeing here is media coverage. And when we talk about gender, I want to say we see media coverage on males, Black males, minorities, but the same instances were happening. And these are just three instances that I wanted to talk about because they received a lot of media coverage. There were women, Black women that sustained the same, or if not worse, injuries. And a lot of individuals don't know about that, did not know unless you read the literature, correct? Well, prior to 1970, research was conducted. There was limited studies that focused on women, women being minority Black women, indigenous women, and even white women at the same time. Women were only mentioned if in reference to male frames to support the literature that supported the end of the circumstances of different policing practices and things that were going on socially, politically, and economically. They were only mentioned to support that. So we moved towards realizing that women were not mentioned unless it was to support the male frames. That's one. Now we're going to move to a very important text that I think everyone should take a look at. Andrea Ritchie in 2017, she published a book called Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. It focused on Black women, it focused on girls, trans, and non-gender conforming individuals. And what she wanted to talk about was the differences in policing practices, the things that occur and happen that have not had the same attention that needed to be happening as far as the disparity. So when we talk about a disparity, we're talking about there are differences. When we look at the total, we look at the population, Blacks represent 12 to 13% of the population. But when we talk about entering the criminal justice system, police encounters, mass incarceration, we represent more than any other racial and ethnic group. So that's something that we need to talk about. That's one. Now I want to move towards a study was conducted in 1990 by Regina A. Arnold. And what she looked at is that women of color, specifically Black women, are often criminalized before they even encounter police officers. What does that mean by being criminalized? That means that you have certain external things that are associated with you that play into your criminalization when entering or encountering negative police encounters. You are criminalized by your family, you're criminalized by patriarchy, you're criminalized by structural dislocation, you're criminalized by racism. We're often criminalized by economic marginality, which often when we do research, we call that SES, social economic status. So now we got through the historical overview very quick. I want to move towards the theoretical approaches. It's two theories that I want you guys to pay attention to that I mentioned that really stood out. First is Black feminist thought, which is a standpoint theory, Patricia Hill Collins. And then I'll get into the second theory. With Black feminist thought, Patricia Hill Collins mentioned something that really stood out to me called the matrix of domination. That says that there are interlocking systems of oppression that women, Black women specifically, are forced to endure based upon their race, their gender, their social economic status. And those interlocking systems of oppression influence whether they are considered the inferior group. And it plays into their negative experience in society. Why is that even important when we talk about policing? Because all of those factors, when we do research, are certain variables that we look at when we look at research. We look at social economic status. We look at individual's race. We look at gender. And just like my colleague said, when we talk about race, race has been socially constructed. There is a sociological theorist that I think about. We talk about Karl Marx in my sociology course, and we say that race, we talk about how race has been used to benefit the bourgeoisie or the working elite, the elite, whereas it's a way to keep that power structure and that social hierarchy stratified, and stratified meaning based upon if you're in low, middle, or high class. So Black feminist thought looks at gender, race, class, and sexuality. And those different divisions affect women, Black women, in the different sectors of society. So one of the sectors of society is the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system. I also want to move towards the methodological approaches. I completed a study recently where I looked at a data set from the New York Police Department, Stop, Question, and Frisk. I pulled 2 years, 2011, and I looked at 2019. 2011 was monumental because that was the most recorded stops in New York for pedestrians. And 2019 was the most current year. I wanted to use that data set specifically to see if the results would be similar or aligned with Black men being stopped, because a lot of the literature supported Black men and those negative encounters with police officers. So I pulled the data set. What the data showed me was that in 2011, race and social economic status played monumental, and Black women were stopped, frisked, questioned, and arrested more than white women. Now in 2019, the results showed that social economic status was a major indicator in Black women being stopped. So this goes into my next theory, social disorganization theory. Social disorganization theory looks at ecological conditions and the structural locations of neighborhoods. Why is that important? Because it gives the broken windows theory, broken windows policing. When we look at specific areas and we go in with more aggressive behavior based upon there being a lack of social resources, a lack of informal and social control. All these factors play into the type of policing practices and the things that we have seen. I also want to mention, along with the methodological approaches, what really stood when I was doing my research, I experienced Breonna Taylor. That was a part of what I went through. So it was important that we move beyond theory for Black women and women of color. Right. And that's why CRT is so important. CRT is so important because it says, hey, you need to look at the system, and you also need to understand that the system is flawed. I also tell my students something when they ask about how do we fix the system. The criminal justice and criminal legal system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's maintaining social order and social control for the powers who hold what you can and cannot do, right? So the system was never created to serve individuals unless you are considered the dominant group. And because people of color, Black women, Black men, Indigenous women are considered the minority group, it is serving just what is going on. So I always like to move forward past the literature. What do we do? What needs to be done? My question is, how are we going to change it? We talk, we sit up here, we talk about this, we give this information. So what, in my mind, when I think of CRT, what's the next steps? The next steps is we need a new system, because the system is not being fixed. It's not being reformed. We need a whole new system that focuses on the equity, not the equality, but the equity. Why the equity? Because the equity states that individuals who are less getting the resources, they're not having the same starting point as the dominant group. We make sure that the minority groups, based upon your race and your ethnic origin, you have an equal start. Equality means you give everyone a starting playing field. Equity means some people need a little bit more than what is being offered, right? So that is the most important of really understanding when we talk about equity, inclusion, when we talk about disparities, when we talk about all these key terms, what does it really mean? It really means that for me, when I think of CRT, I think of, hey, we acknowledge that the system is wrong. We acknowledge and we see the racial, gender, and ethnic disparities, but now we need to move past talking about it and we need to put action. And my action and my solution is we need a new system. And thank you, everyone. That concludes my presentation.
So I'm going to begin by setting a mental stage for this part of the conversation about how critical race theory affects our thinking on issues relative to the criminal justice system, or really the criminal legal system, because we know justice ain't really just. Erroneously, the phrase critical race theory is suffering from what I call appropriation by a population that would have those of us who are aware believe that it is a training that is given to our children in K through 12. It has devolved into no more than angry propaganda. More recently, the attack on CRT has been extended to the very college campuses where the idea of examining the role of race and racism in our society should be housed, where scholarly minds can develop critical thinking and analysis skills through freedom of thought. It has become such an issue that colleges and universities in states such as Texas and Alabama are fighting back against statewide bills by passing resolutions supporting academic freedom. We should probably feel fortunate that the governor of Maryland has stated that he does not see CRT as a significant issue. Here in Montgomery County, the county council stands firmly behind racial equity and social justice. And of course, our own Montgomery College has taken the lead on conversations of race with our Let's Talk series and now with our CRT series. Thank you, Sharon and Jeanette. By now, we all know that CRT is not race or diversity training, but is a way of examining and questioning the role of race and racism from various lenses and perspectives. In 1989, the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw and her peers organized a presentation where the term critical race theory was coined to, in their words, make it clear that our work locates itself in intersection of critical theory and race, racism, and the law. The basis of this conversation that we are having today is a word that is still uncomfortable being used in general company, the word race. We should eventually become comfortable with it, as it is the basis of power inequity, hurt, pain, and even discovery for an entire population of people globally. Since people of African descent first set foot on the shores of this continent as slaves, because of course, according to Ivan van Sertima, we came before Columbus. Race has been used to objectify, minimize, dehumanize, and even kill those whose skin color was a representation of all that they themselves were not. The hatred of these people with their show of fortitude and strength, even in the face of brutality and murder, was so great that the need to continue to make money off of free Black labor, such a deeply entrenched part of the culture, that systems were created to ensure the oppression and control of those people. Hence the creation of the slave patrol, mostly a fixture in the South, but certainly the North had its own version of what oppression of Black people looked like. I imagine it looked much like how relationships with our well-meaning anti-racist allies look today, saying all the right things, but actions carrying the mission in the completely opposite direction. Meanwhile, formal policing structures were being created in the North, and those policing positions filled with white men who, just like the white sharecropper in the South, needed to sustain a certain way of life that did not include citizenship for or equity with Black people. So here we are more than 400 years later, and Black oppression looks different, but no less harmful. Black men and women suffer from notable syndromes, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, imposter syndrome, which someone told me today they didn't like the word syndrome, but it was a syndrome for me when I was a 28-year veteran in policing, because I shared it with my sisters, right? Trauma as a result of daily microaggressions and even death at the hands and knees of the police. Even Black police officers suffer from their own specialized racial offenses inside police departments, where the social construct of race, coupled with the systemic and institutional power inequities in police subcultures, relegate Black men to the bottom tiers of the police hierarchy and Black women to the basement. In addition, CRT would have us acknowledge that race also intersects with gender identity and sexuality as well. CRT means that we must recognize that the legacy of slavery is stronger even than my ability to trace my West African ancestry no further than 1823, and that the oppressive holdouts from slavery through Reconstruction, the Civil Rights era, the fake war on drugs, and the protests and uprisings after the murder of George Floyd is still to be reckoned with, and to do so, we must address race head on. Let's begin by acknowledging that law enforcement works as intended. Its format was never about uplifting people or even protecting and serving, but about power and control and white supremacy. The decades changed, but the premise remained the same. In our Montgomery College criminal justice class, which we call 201, Introduction to Law Enforcement, the text breaks down policing by decades. It discusses subjects such as corruption and racial issues experienced by the public in interactions with the police. The text talks about the various police commissions that have been created to study issues with ineffective policing. There was the Wickersham Commission of 1929, created by J. Edgar Hoover. It was the first national commission to study the criminal justice system. The report indicated that officers were ineffective, poorly trained, not honest, racist, brutal, and not being disciplined. The public, what? They called for police reform. In 1967, President Johnson established the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice to, that's right, study the criminal justice system. President Johnson created this commission during one of the most racially contentious times in our country, the Civil Rights era, and just a year before the death of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Do not forget the actions of the police during Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. The commission made several recommendations, one of which was that there needed to be a focus on law enforcement being more fair, especially concerning minority groups, the poor, and juveniles. And for that to happen, there would have to be a deep dive into police personnel practices. Who is and who becomes members of law enforcement? But in addition, some very important suggestions became part of the fabric of policing. One was that the federal government should provide funding by way of grants to state and local law enforcement in order to develop community-oriented policing programs that would have them effectively work with communities. The other was a move towards thinking of criminal justice as an actual system. Then there was the creation of one of the most important and recognizable commissions to study policing in our history, and that was the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, better known as the Kerner Commission, and you might be more familiar with the Kerner Commission. This was established in 1968 after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. The study was commissioned to research the root cause of the rioting in this country, but many factors surrounding law enforcement were recognized. One of them was that poverty and institutional racism were the basis of inner city violence. The report actually said, segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. The report went on to say that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. This was in 1968, everyone. The report also went on to say that abrasive relationships between the police and Negroes, which is what they called us then, and other minority groups have been a major source of grievance, tension, and ultimately disorder. The commission further reported that nervous police and National Guardsmen sometimes fired their weapons recklessly after hearing gunshots, and that this resulted in the deaths of African Americans during the riots. Please be aware that one of the things that drove the commission's work was the fear that white people had that they would be harmed during the riots. There were riots in all the major cities and even smaller cities and towns in America. Dozens of people lost their lives, and while unnecessary loss of life is tragic, I do think it is safe to say that the African American community suffered the greatest loss, as it was not only loss of life to account for, but loss of livelihood, loss of safe passage, loss of safe harbor, loss of safe homes, and loss of safe minds. President Obama's task force on 21st century policing was established with a report issued in 2015. The task force was formed with the DOJ's, Department of Justice's, Community-Oriented Policing Services Office, the COPS office, leading the way. The co-chairs of the task force stated that it was created to strengthen community policing and trust among law enforcement officers and the communities they serve, especially in light of recent events around the country that have underscored the need for and importance of lasting collaborative relationships between local police and the public. So community policing. The task force was made up of diverse members of the law enforcement community, as well as the community at large, and comment was taken from a similar range of law enforcement and community members. As a result of its work, the task force developed 6 pillars and a laundry list of recommendations that stemmed from the pillars, and you can see the pillars in the slide. It was one of the few times that law enforcement agencies across the country were actually eager to get behind recommendations made to positively change policing and public safety. In 2019, President Trump established the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice. That bears the same title as President Johnson's first commission. Its purpose was to study the state of policing in America and come up with suggestions for crime reduction and promote the rule of law. However, before the commission's report was scheduled to be released in November of 2020, a federal judge stopped the release as a result of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund filing a lawsuit, stating that the commission, which was comprised solely of current and former law enforcement, lacked the diversity that was expected in order to address any of the pressing issues plaguing policing. Later, the judge ruled that the commission either come into compliance with the law or publish a disclaimer that they did not follow the law. So rather than come into compliance, the choice was made to publish the report with a disclaimer. The report issued in December of 2020 made no mention of how to address community efforts, especially in today's current climate, but was very heavy on how to ensure public respect of the police. These are only a few of the many national and local commissions created, some with a mandate to study law enforcement directly, some studying police as an indirect result of other things that they were looking at. Most had the same or similar findings, that law enforcement is faced with deep-rooted challenges and that many of these challenges are consistently race-based, ethics-based, and performance-based, yet are rarely addressed in any sustainable way. So I will start my close by saying, here we are in 2022. What great police reforms have been created? So I would never say that there has been no movement at all towards progressive reform that can build healthy and whole police officers or healthy and whole citizens and citizens' trust or police legitimacy. But after decades of commissions and task forces and studies, we certainly should expect to be further along. I contend that the system needs to be deconstructed for efficiency, but right now we are working with what we can. There are many great forces that work against making change in law enforcement, and the unequal power dynamic between police and the community is one of the most compelling hurdles to sustainable reform that exists. It is the unequal power dynamic that supported slave patrols in the South and the oppression of Black people, both slave and free, in the North. The question is always what can be done, and I'm sure we'll hear these questions later. What I can say is what does not work. Creating meaningful policy, training, and oversight, either inside police departments or in our legislatures, does not work without buy-in from all the stakeholders, especially community stakeholders. An example of that is the Justice and Policing Act that bears George Floyd's name, which passed the House of Representatives, but did not make any movement in the Senate and is now tabled. The purpose of the bill has been stated to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct, etc. Yet the portions of the bill that could best address these objectives were the ones that the Senate had the most difficulty with. In addition, police unions and other traditional police organizations lobbied the Hill, and those boots on the ground social justice organizations were not asked to weigh in on the bill, nor were Black police organizations other than NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, who could have offered input about not only the communities they serve, but a unique perspective about the communities they also grew up in. Understanding that most of the suggested mandates in the JPA were tied to federal funding, we can also surmise that there are law enforcement agencies that will pass on the money, they don't want the money, to sustain policing subculture instead, where they will not feel forced to produce data or take actions that are not popular with police, excuse me. An examination of the JPA would take an entire conversation, so we're not gonna talk about it right now, but I would love to come back and talk about the whole bill, okay? I will also opine that sustainable progress can only be made if police chiefs, commissioners, sheriffs, directors of federal agencies, and all executive police leadership, including members of NOBLE, are held accountable for hiring and oversight by those who hired and oversee them, whether it's a county executive or the voter who elects the sheriffs. And finally, it is on a local and state level that most sustainable police reform will be created, in my opinion. The federal government has very little that it can do to make changes for other than federal law enforcement, as state and local jurisdictions have the most power over their law enforcement agencies. And the downside is that that leaves us with possibly more than 50 models of policing. As a note, in my opinion, states such as Colorado and Maryland are at the fore of making extensive change in policing that will help to save Black lives and change the working conditions for police officers for the better. So I'm hoping you learned something new today. Teaching authentic and truthful racial history, not history redesigned or denied, is necessary. Not only so that we will not repeat the mistakes of the past, but so that an entire group of people can come to terms with the harm that has been done to us. We have not been allowed to move past the hurt or the pain because there has been no acknowledgement of the whips, the chains, the water hoses, the police dogs, the lack of protection from police, the death by police. We are barely allowed to talk about it without someone screaming that we are trying to foment fear and guilt, and without acknowledging the fear and guilt that is the legacy of those Black people whose ancestors, like mine, were slaves in this country and who have been searching for humane treatment for 400 years. So, if I may offer this last takeaway, is that we do not know these things if we do not purposefully study them or have these conversations. If these interactions leave us feeling uncomfortable, like the whole conversation I just had with you, then we should know that it means we are doing the work And I'm committed to doing that work. I believe that this study, this learning, this sharing of knowledge, and being at work about it is what CRT is all about.
I have been tasked with talking about intervention, right? And we might also refer to intervention as interruption. Right? That's a term that you often hear in peace and conflict studies. Interruption is a term that we use when we are talking about breaking vicious cycles. And certainly systemic racism and the revolving door of the criminal justice system constitute vicious cycles, right? So I'm taking a cue from Dr. Jones, right? And engaging in conversation rather than presentation. I'm not going to pretend that, that I have her pipes and that I can deliver with quite the force that she can. But I'm happy to be here and have this chat with you all. So what might interruption look like? Well, it could look like dismantling the system entirely and creating new systems and structures to replace what already exists, right? And you heard Dr. Jones reference that, right? I think that kind of burning down of what currently exists and replacing it with something new. But interruption might also include leveraging existing resources to change existing systems and structures in an effort to make them operate in a more just manner. Right? And I think that's part of what Professor Pruitt was referencing at the end of her presentation. Yes, we need significant change. Perhaps we need some new systems, but sometimes we have to work with what we have. So if we start by talking about existing structures, right, and working to better what is currently in place, where might be one place that we begin? And I will suggest to all of you that political advocacy is an amazingly powerful tool for change, right? And I know that folks are tired, right, of politics. They associate politics with polarization. But the reality is that we live in a political society, right? This is the framework within which we operate. You also heard Professor Pruitt, reference the fact that real change in this arena, right? If we're talking about change to the criminal legal system, that it happens at the state and the local level. That's where we can be most effective. So I want to talk to you all about states' attorneys' races. Right? Not everyone knows that there is an elected state's attorney in every county in the state of Maryland and in Baltimore City. Right? These are folks who you vote into office. And even if there are unjust laws on the books, even if law enforcement are engaging in unjust enforcement practices, your elected state's attorney has the discretion to make policy decisions, right? So I maintain that state's attorney position, that race, that's the most important race of any local election cycle. And we are in an election cycle right now, right? 2022 is an election year in Maryland. You may be paying attention to the governor's race. Maybe you're looking at some of your, state delegate or your state senator races, but I'm going to task you with looking at the races for state's attorney. So what does an elected state's attorney do? These people really aren't in the trenches. They're not trying cases, but they set policy priorities. They can implement diversionary remedies. They can implement alternatives to prosecution, right? They have a great deal of power in the criminal justice system. And I'll use drug cases as an example here to illustrate that. So we know that the research indicates that rates of drug possession, use, sale, they're similar across racial and ethnic and socioeconomic groups. But we also know from the data that people of color are investigated, arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated at higher rates than their white counterparts. Right? So what do state's attorneys have to do with this? How might they be able to intervene or interrupt, right, to help rectify this injustice, right, this disparate racial impact? Well, again, they can implement non-prosecution policies. We saw that in Baltimore City during the COVID-19 pandemic. State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby made the decision to enter a null pros, which is akin to a dismissal in an array of criminal offenses. So even if the police arrested someone for simple possession of narcotics, the state's attorney's office elected not to prosecute that case, right? The state's attorney's office has the power to do that, regardless of the action that was taken by the police. And, Johns Hopkins has studied this practice. It was very controversial. It also involved, non-prosecution of crimes related to sex work and other nonviolent offenses. And the Hopkins study told us that these non-prosecution decisions are not correlated with higher crime rates, right? That's something that we often hear from folks who are trying to fearmonger in an effort to stymie change, right? But we know that it's not true. The data doesn't support that. In a drug case, the state's attorney could also offer a diversionary remedy, right? They can strike a deal, right? A bargain with a defendant who might be suffering from substance use disorder. And perhaps if that person agrees to enter a treatment program, then the state can elect to dismiss that case. Or if it's a prosecutor that insists on keeping a case in the system, they have the power to refer more cases to drug courts that exist in so many of our jurisdictions, right? This type of specialty court that does unfortunately result in criminal conviction, but that is more treatment focused, is more therapeutic, is a bit more trauma responsive, right? And that really focuses on the healing that's necessary in recovery, right? So we don't have that revolving door, so that we don't see people back into the system. With respect to state's attorneys, there's a lot of national momentum surrounding the election of state's attorneys who are focused on the promotion of racial equity and racially just outcomes. And there is momentum surrounding the election of former public defenders, right, as elected state's attorneys, taking people who have worked on the other side of the aisle, right, giving them the power to advance these policy directives and to affect change in that way, right? And it's not just national momentum, it's happening here in Maryland this year as well. We see a few former public defenders who are running to be the state's attorneys in their jurisdictions. So find out who's running, in your county, if you live in Montgomery County or one of the neighboring counties, and do some research, determine who shares your values. What are their prosecution priorities? Are they talking about racial justice and racial equity as part of their platform, right? That's something we can do to affect change. But with respect to those elections, I just want to note that many of these races in Maryland are decided during the primaries. Right? A lot of counties are either deeply blue or deeply red, and those primary elections are on June 28th, right? So, to participate in the system, to make sure that your voice is heard, it's important to register to vote if you're eligible to register to vote, and to show up and to cast that ballot. And I know that that's one of the calls to action that I saw in the document that Sharon shared with us. In addition to participating in the political process, or exercising our franchise, our right to the franchise, we can also engage in legislative advocacy. Pay attention to what is happening at the county council. Pay attention to what is happening in the Maryland General Assembly. We're in session right now, right, in Maryland. Session runs from January to April of every year. If you go to the state legislature's website, it's cumbersome, it's challenging to navigate, but you can find an organization, a partisan organization that shares your values, or a nonpartisan organization that is committed to dismantling systemic racism, and you can sign up for their legislative alerts, right? And so you can track bills, that affect people and that often seek to rectify disparate outcomes based on race, or perhaps it's something that might create a disparate outcome, right, based on race. So it's something that you want to oppose, right, rather than support. So one example of an organization and a bill that is currently in the Maryland General Assembly, the organization is the Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women. Right, we heard, Dr. Jones talk about Dr. Patricia Hill Collins and intersectionality, right? And the Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women is not just an organization that advocates on behalf of women, but that does take an intersectional approach and that endeavors to support legislation that improves outcomes for women of color, right, in particular. So one bill that they are supporting this session. And I will say that, as an MC employee, right, I am not stating support for or opposition to any current piece of legislation. But this is a bill, right, through which we can apply that critical race lens. It's House Bill 454. It's called the Prevention of Forced Infant Separation Act. And, this bill, so what happens when pregnant women are incarcerated and they give birth during their period of incarceration is that they only spend, right, the 1 to 2 days that they are in the hospital with their babies, right? And then their babies are taken from them. And if there's no other family member to care for that baby, then that baby goes into the foster care system. Right, so this bill would allow mothers who deliver their babies while they're incarcerated to remain with them in an alternative facility for up to a year. Right, and studies suggest that this first year of a child's life is formative. It's formative physically, cognitively, socially. Right, and so why does this matter for women of color? Well, Black women are disproportionately represented in Maryland's prison system. And in 2019, 63% of pregnant women in state custody were Black women, right? And when we separate mothers and their children just days after the children are born, there are negative consequences for both the mother and the child, right? It increases the stress level for the baby, right? Those children are more likely to grow up, to develop PTSD, to develop substance use disorder as adults, and the mothers are more likely to suffer from postpartum depression, from grief, from detachment, right? So this is an example of a piece of legislation, right, to which we can apply this critical race lens to try to rectify some of the injustice in our system. I am just about out of time. One of the other things I wanted to address were alternatives to legal intervention, but Eric and Kelly, I think, did an amazing job of discussing some of that with the Choice program. But I would just quickly note, I've heard students say, or I've heard in other forums like the Let's Talk series, people say, well, what can I do if I don't want to involve the police? I'm scared of the police. I don't trust the police. Is there some other way that I can problem solve? And so one example that I will give is community mediation. There are free community mediation centers across the state of Maryland. They use what is called the inclusive model of mediation. That's a model that meets people where they are. There's no control of language. It's not as directive as other forms of mediation. And they will mediate any type of dispute, right? Even if it's a dispute that involves something that might be considered criminal behavior, right? So this might be a way for some folks to reclaim their autonomy and to solve problems that they have with individuals or within their communities, right? Without official state intervention.